Well, with the federal budget just about a month away, what is the lay of the land for Canada's economy? How optimistic should Canadians be about our future? Well, here is your weekly West Block Primer. The government says that Canada's economic performance gives us a lot of lift. But while we may be better off than most, our debt load weighs us down. The feds peg Canada's debt at about $617 billion. That's about 32% of what we produce. It's called the GDP. By world standards, that's actually pretty good. But that doesn't include the debt from other levels of government, and total public debt is how the rest of the world judges us. So, if you added provincial debt to the total federal debt, it would be a whopping $1 trillion, or about 87% of GDP. And that means that for every dollar we make, 87 cents is spoken for by the debt, even if we're not very good at paying it. One way the government hopes to tackle this, by selling resources, lots of them, and mainly oil. But for that to happen, the product has to get to market. And the pipeline that would make that happen down south has been tied up in political knots, while the western northern gateway is in growing doubt in British Columbia. Without a plan B, Canada's lift will continue to be held down by its debt. So the man in charge of dealing with all that debt is Finance Minister Jim Flaherty. He's in Davos at the World Economic Forum today, but just before he left, I sat down with him for an exclusive interview. Have a listen. Mr. Flaherty, good to have you on the show again. Thanks very much for being here.
Pleasure.
I just want to take a look at the landscape of the Canadian economy heading into the budget, which I guess is coming in the next few weeks anyway. Back in the fall, you said that the deficit was going to be $7 billion greater than what had been projected. Since that time, are things getting better? Are they getting worse?
Things are still on track. We're on track to a balanced budget in this Parliament, which means by 2015, 2016. That fiscal year. That was always our plan, and we're still on plan. Growth is a little bit weaker internationally, but Canadian growth is about on track. We're around 2% or so real GDP growth.
But have we made up that $7 billion that we were behind in the fall?
We've made it up in this way. That's commodity prices, really. And it affects not only us, it affects Alberta, it affects Australia, all the commodity-oriented nations in the world and jurisdictions. But what we've done is we've really watched our own spending, and we've pulled back our own spending over the course of the past 2-3 years, and that's working.
Let's take a look at some numbers that you don't have any direct control over, and that's the provincial debts in this country. We've seen governments that were in surplus 5 years ago slipping into deficit. We've seen Ontario, whose deficit is going to, or debt rather, is going to be 40% of GDP. When you take a look at those provincial numbers, how much of a threat does that represent to the Canadian economy?
It's a significant worry, and I met with my provincial colleagues just before Christmas, and we talked about this at some length. Ontario's deficit, Quebec's deficit, New Brunswick. There are several provinces that the bond rating agencies can have a look at and say, we know that the federal government is there and the federal government is in a good fiscal situation, but these provinces aren't. It can affect sort of the Canadian brand. So I encourage them to deal with their deficits. They need to do exactly what the United States needs to do, and that is have a medium-term fiscal plan to get back to balanced budgets. President Obama's administration, the Congress has to do the same thing in the United States to be credible.
We've got skill shortages across this country that are impacting our ability to do things. At the same time, we've got this massive youth unemployment issue because they don't have the skills to match what we need right now. We got into this mess through a whole bunch of different ways, but I'm interested to know what you think the way out of this is, because the lives of so many young people depend on this.
Well, we're working hard on this, and you're absolutely right, Tom. I mean, it's the number one issue that's come up in our consultations wherever we are in Canada, and it's not just in the oil patch. It's in Newfoundland and Labrador, it's in British Columbia, it's in Montreal in the aeronautics industry. It's in the mining industry across the country. So this is the number one issue.
Do we have to invest more in this, especially skills training?
I think we do, but there are a lot of good examples in the private sector because they need these folks, right? And they're in apprenticeships, in journeymen, in internships. There's a lot that can be done to match people with the skills available. A lot of it is, to me, is connectivity. There are young people who are, staying at home and not working, who are relatively well educated, who have post-secondary education, who just need a chance. Whether they get paid a lot or not is not as important as getting connected with the business community.
You're going over to Davos in a few hours from now. Is there one topic that is going to dominate your hallway conversations and your dinners? Is there one thing that everybody's got their eye on at this point?
Well, two things, really. I mean, people will talk about global economic growth and about the IMF saying it's going to be a bit lower or whatever. But it doesn't mean a lot because the emerging economies, China and so on, are doing relatively well. The Europeans, for the most part, are in recession, except for the Germans, perhaps. What's going on in Europe, the need for Europe to act more quickly on their reforms. We've been talking about this for several years. And then the Americans needing to act because eventually the chickens will come home to roost. You can't just keep running up deficits and debt in the trillions and not have consequences somewhere down the road. So finance ministers are supposed to look a little bit down the road. I hope we do, and I try to. And so that's, I think, will be, those two areas will be the dominant conversation points.
Let me take you domestically now to the question of the parliamentary budget officer. We know that Kevin Page's term is up in March. You've had your ups and downs with Mr. Page. I think you've called him unreliable and unbelievable at times. However, this office was created by your government. Has it been a net benefit?
Not yet. I think the idea, and I was there in those discussions in the early days of our government, because I've been there since the beginning. The idea was that the parliamentary budget officer would kind of work like the congressional budget officer in the United States to report to the elected people in the House of Commons about how the government was doing in its budgeting, sort of being a sounding board, a testing board. He's kind of gone off that course, and I think that course was the right course, and it could be very valuable to members of Parliament of all parties, including my own party. But he's been kind of wandering off that and going in other places.
Is that because of Kevin Page, or is that because of the mandate of the office?
I can't really say. I think that the mandate perhaps could be better defined. Mr. Page and I have had our differences. I mean, we've met, we've talked about the differences, and he's offered different opinions at different times on the same subjects, which I find difficult to accept.
Does this indicate then that before you appoint, and I presume you are going to appoint a new parliamentary budget officer, perhaps actually I should start with that question. Will you appoint a new PBO?
Sure, there's a process to be followed, and the process will be followed.
Will you change the mandate?
I think we'll have a discussion about that. Personally, I would like to see a more defined mandate, yes.
We know that the future of the Keystone Pipeline is in the balance at the moment. Northern Gateway, at best, seems to be a little bit stalled. How much of a hit to the Canadian economy would a rejection of Keystone be?
It would be a hit on employment right away, and also a hit on U.S. employment. I mean, President Obama appointed a group of leading business people to recommend him what he could do about unemployment in the United States. Their first recommendation is do the pipeline because of the employment, and he hasn't done that yet. I hope he does, because it's vitally important, not only for us but for the Americans. So that would be a negative on employment. There are other alternatives, as you know, pipelines to the east, to New Brunswick, to St. John, pipeline to Churchill, pipeline through the Rockies, pipeline to Alaska. There are lots of alternatives. We can explore all of them, and it's one of our priorities, major projects to encourage economic growth and exports.
Minister, thanks very much for being here. I've appreciated your time.
My pleasure, Tom.
Well, after those damning comments, we asked the parliamentary budget officer, Kevin Page, for his response. And in a statement to us, he says this: with great respect to the Minister of Finance, there is no mention of sounding board or similar language in the Act of Parliament. We believe that we have promoted fiscal transparency and have made financial analysis available to parliamentarians and Canadians that was not provided by the government and public service. We have worked hard to be timely, relevant, and authoritative. Parliament resumes sitting tomorrow, and the first question in question period goes to my next guest, the Leader of the Official Opposition and the Leader of the NDP, Tom Mulcair. Mr. Mulcair, good to have you here this morning.
Morning, Tom.
We've just heard some pretty strong words from the Finance Minister about the Parliamentary Budget Officer, basically saying that he has not been a benefit to Canada in the last 5 years. What's your take on this?
My take on it is that the Conservatives will throw under the bus anyone who doesn't tell them what they want to hear. Thank goodness Kevin Page has been there for the past 5 years. Thanks to him, we've known the real cost of the F-35. The Conservatives had one set of books for the cabinet ministers, one set of books for the public. They weren't telling us the truth. Same thing with the cost of the war in Afghanistan, and on and on. Every time there's been a disagreement between Kevin Page and Jim Flaherty and the Conservative government, it's Kevin Page who's been telling Canadians the truth, and there's a reason for that. It's an institution that was created under the Accountability Act. What's interesting now, as the Conservatives start their 8th year in power, they're trying to dial back accountability. So they're going to try to come up with all sorts of reasons why they have to change the institution, but what they're trying to change is having anybody out there who can contradict them by telling Canadians the truth. There's nothing more important that we do as parliamentarians than deciding how public money is spent. Kevin Page has been really helping us in that regard. That's why they want to get rid of the office.
I want to move on to something else that was said last week, and I'm talking about Alison Redford, the Premier of Alberta, who spoke to her province and basically raised a red flag to say that because of falling commodity prices, especially in oil, there's going to be a $6 billion hole in the Alberta budget. I mean, when we get to the point where, you know, Canada's oil-producing province is going into the red, does this raise for you the question about whether it should in fact be a national priority to get Alberta oil out to world markets?
Yes, and I would start by bringing Alberta and other Western oil to the east. We should take care of our own energy security first. We should be creating jobs in Canada as a priority. Do the upgrading here. Instead, we're shipping as much raw bitumen as we can to the U.S. We're not in the east. We're paying the full Brent crude price, which is several dozens of dollars more than the price that they're getting with what they call West Texas Intermediate. But there's also this new Canadian Select price, which is even lower. So that's what they're getting for their bitumen now, as they're shipping it raw. So we haven't been thinking about this long term. If we bring it east, we take care of our energy security, we create jobs in Canada, and of course you've got access to markets through the Atlantic seaboard.
Okay, two things about that, though. If you're going to build pipelines east, first of all, who's going to pay for that? Are you in favor of building more refineries in eastern Canada? And secondly, isn't the issue, though, that our markets are west, not east, west over in Asia, not east in Montreal and Fredericton?
When you look at the Brent crude prices that are being paid along the Atlantic seaboard, you know there's a large market there. The Americans right now, thanks to new technologies, are actually about to become, for the first time in a generation, net oil exporters. So that's quite a sea change. So it's changed the market forces, and it's changed the value of what we can export. I mean, I'll give you another example. It's not just with regard to oil that this is changing things. Hydro-Quebec, which has green renewable hydroelectricity that it likes to export to the States at top dollar, has seen those prices drop dramatically because they're using the new influx of natural gas to produce electricity a lot cheaper in the States. So the energy market in North America is changing. We've got to adapt to it. Who pays for it? I mean, the private companies have a reason to want to be getting the Brent crude price, Tom. There's no disincentive for them to do that, subject always to a full and rigorous environmental review. That's the #1 problem with the Conservatives. They've been gutting environmental legislation, so they might get a regulatory license, but there's no social license. The public doesn't believe them. That's the #1 problem we've got right now.
Okay. Just before we leave that, though, are you saying that, in your view, no public money needs to go into a west-east pipeline?
No, there can be public incentive. There can be ways of incentivizing this. Don't forget, the Conservatives, for years, have been subsidizing some of the worst polluters in Canada. So that's not the way to go. But if there is a way to create this infrastructure and to create jobs, and we can do something to find a better market at a better price, of course we should be looking at those options. What is most important is whatever else happens with global warming, we're still going to have to heat our homes. There's still a lot of oil that's going to be needed in Canada for transportation and for heating, and we should take care of our own energy security needs first. We should make that part of our priority as we look at energy issues across the country.
Let's take a look at what's going to happen on the Hill starting tomorrow, and let's look out 2 years to the next election. This is sort of a pivotal point. This is halfway through the majority mandate for the Harper government. How do you, as the NDP, in the next 2 years show that you're ready to government and not just a Quebec party, which is where most of your members are?
good, competent public administration. We've been showing the record. We met with a lot of the provincial leaders of the NDP, and our NDP premiers talked a lot about good governance and the record of the NDP. We've been in power in 5 different provinces and in 1 territory. The one exception to that, of course, was the Ba-Ray regime in Ontario. Nothing personal, but it's a fact that it wasn't a huge success in terms of public administration. Other than that, we've got a sterling record in terms of balanced budgets, and it's that type of reliability that we're going to bring to the Canadian public in the next election. When you look at what they did with the F-35s, the worst debacle of public spending in recent Canadian history, you realize that Canadians deserve better, and we in the NDP know we can do better.
Mr. Mulcair, always good having you on, and we'll see you up here again tomorrow. Take care.
Pleasure, Tom. Bye-bye.